Folks, we've been gone for a few weeks now, you may have noticed, and I just didn't want to leave you without an explanation as to why that is. And the reason for our absence is that Alex is lazy. But we do have more episodes recorded, we will be coming out with more stuff, and hopefully we'll be getting back onto a regular schedule in the near future. Now, without further ado, DJ, please drop that beat. Hello and welcome to the Weekly Artifact. I'm Justin and this is my co-host.
Hi, I'm Alex.
We're two former creative writing majors searching for meaning in a sea of content. Every other week we will select one piece of content each, an article, a video, another podcast, that we found particularly interesting and discuss it. As always, our comments are our own and are not associated with any institution.
The show may contain explicit language or themes. See the show notes for specific content warnings. Hey Justin, what do you got today?
So, this week, my article... Scroll up. Okay.
Well, you're on the clock still, Chief.
Oh, shit. This week, my article is called Is Masculinity a Terrorist Ideology? By Lacey M. Johnson. Johnson is a victim of abuse herself, so that's the perspective that she's coming from, and she's upfront about that in the article. And she's basically starts off telling about how frequent it is to hear stories on television or the radio about men abusing women in case of domestic violence, and how she talks about how every minute 20 people have been physically abused, and she also gives more stats which I'll touch upon throughout the article, but one of the more shocking ones perhaps was she says, statistically speaking, most abusers are men and most victims are women. Some studies claim that on average, 1 in 4 women will experience severe abuse from an intimate partner at some point in her life. Others suggest 1 in 3. So the article continues on, and a lot of the article is actually quoting or drawing from a book by a woman named Snyder, who has also written about domestic violence in various countries that she's studied in, done her research in. And she sort of talks about some reasons why people will stay with abusers that often come down to economic dependence. You know, if the choice is between domestic abuse and homelessness, a lot of people will end up going with domestic abuse and putting up with that. But also various legal rights that people do or don't have, and also just the way that abusers will tend to isolate people from their support systems that could help them to escape. And also later she points out that even just attempting to leave can increase the violent likelihood of the woman being killed by 75%. So it can be very dangerous both to your health and also to your just economic stability to try and leave an abusive relationship. So the one where Johnson sort of divides away from Snyder, I suppose, is in thinking about Snyder is more interested in how can women survive domestic abuse, whereas Johnson is more interested in why are so many men committing abuse in the first place. And so pretty much her thesis kind of comes a little bit after she makes that point where she says, could it be that masculinity itself is a violent ideology? And she draws from a study by the American Psychological Association that acknowledged connections between masculine ideology and a particular constellation of standards that have held sway over large segments of the population, including anti-femininity, achievement, eschewal of the appearance of weakness and adventure, risk, and violence. And so it says that, according to this report, masculine ideology demands that men and boys suppress vulnerability and human connection, restrict their emotion to only confidence or aggression, value themselves in terms of their powers over others, and accumulate power through intimidation and force. Masculine ideology is linked to homophobia, bullying, sexual assault, and intimate partner violence. So basically, drawing from the American Psychological Association report to think about different things that sort of masculine gender seems to be associated with. And she talks about 2016, where 68 people died from terror attacks, but in that same year, more than 1,800 women were murdered by men, 93% of those being by men that the women knew. And more than half of the women killed in this country are murdered by current or former intimate partners. And always the person most likely to be killed by a man with a gun isn't a terrorist or a serial killer or even a burglar, it's himself and his family. And she talks about some like high profile examples of mass shooters that have all committed violence against women prior to carrying out their mass shootings, which is sort of interesting to think about why that might be. And then closer to the end, she talks about a little bit more about her own abuse and points out how, presumably there's people who knew about it, whether it just be her neighbors that she suspects could probably hear the abuse going on, just based on the way that the sort of apartment was set up. The walls were thin enough that they would probably be able to hear her being abused. But also how apparently her abuser now lives in Venezuela, where I guess he can't be extradited, and so Shara says like all the bystanders and people who have abetted this violence perhaps share a small part of his blame. So then she sort of concludes that basically men can perhaps play a role in the solution. He tells a story about a panelist who stood up for her when she was being harassed at a panel one time, and basically says, if men, those like my fellow panelists, can choose to work towards dismantling basically this sort of like toxic masculinity by choosing vulnerability over violence, care over control, men can choose to reduce the harm that masculine ideology does to us all. And yeah, basically just pointing out that we need to start seeing this problem in order to address it. So that's this summary of the article, and you can read the whole thing for yourself. There's a lot of other good stuff in it that I didn't have a chance to get to, but like I said, I would always recommend reading the whole thing. So yeah, I have a few takeaways from this. I think probably like the biggest takeaway just for me personally was just like thinking about all the reasons why victims of abuse don't leave the relationship, and sort of thinking about the ways that capitalism sort of enables that by creating like these situations of economic dependence, and also just the ways that a lot of times we think about, or at least for me, I think about leaving a relationship just as something that you do and then it's over, but in reality, like a lot of times even when the women do try and leave, it only the people, their abusers will still try and find them in some way. So I thought that was probably important to think about. I don't know if you wanted to jump in at all before I kept going.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, as I mean, you're talking about like you end the relationship. That's sort of the end of it. Like as men, you don't really appreciate. I don't know, like all the failings that the justice system has for people in these situations until you either experience it or read about like these statistics and these things, these like just like true numbers of I don't know, just like all the ways that you can still be victimized and susceptible and vulnerable to like the violence and damage of people you're intimate with, either emotionally or physically or both. Even though theoretically we have what we think are safeguards, but like the failings of the the legal system and the like the police and the justice system to like allow these things to perpetuate sort of pretty much unchecked until it's far too late.
Mm-hmm. I kept thinking that there's like a way to sort of think about, is the only answer basically capitalism needs to be fundamentally changed or abolished in order to sort of create the economic independence necessary, or you can even think about whatever, like thinking about the legal system, like you were thinking about like a radical rehauling of the legal system, or is there something to the more individual responsibility aspects of it, I guess, in terms, because she herself at the end sort of seems to imply that when she talks about the bystanders who could have helped her out, that's not really like a systemic change. And I know a lot of people, particularly on the left, are very committed to systemic change, which is, I'm probably more sympathetic to that side. um, but I do think if we're sort of like thinking about Johnson's own conclusion and the idea that men can choose, is her words, like men can choose to reduce the harm that masculine ideology does to us all, whether there's any sort of validity in thinking about sort of like that individual choice aspect or not, like what you thought of her conclusion.
Yeah, well, I know, just from personal experience. I mean, I know I'm like reading all these statistics and all this sort of like the patterns that this happens, and ways to confront it. And I grew up after the age of 6 exclusively in a house like full of women, like and like I was the only male in the house, and so like a lot of these sort of toxic, violent mentalities that sort of fester from being raised in a household that would already perpetuate this. I didn't have as much of that. I mean, obviously, women can still teach this. Spoiler alert for the next article. But from what I sort of lost by only being raised by women, I gained sort of both, the sort of exposure therapy that, from people that you're isolated from. Like if you only grew up in a house full of like men and they were like, fuck women, like obviously like there's no way that can't rub off in some capacity. And so, like knowing that like these are ideas and mentalities that sort of escape me pretty wholly. I mean, obviously, just growing up in America, there's no way to not have these ideations, racially speaking, gendered speaking, but just systemic is the only way to do it. You mean you can't trust people to do this on themselves because obviously that doesn't work. So if it did, it would have by now in some capacity, like it's not gotten like any better in the sense that these articles still need to be written and these things still happen. So like I don't it's like to trust a broken system to like mend itself seems like I don't know, hopelessly dangerously optimistic
Hmm.
and lazy.
Yeah, because yeah, it just seems interesting. She doesn't really seem to, like. I think implicit is are these systemic critiques. It's just sort of interesting that she doesn't choose to end on them. It seem
Mm-hmm.
maybe more appropriate.
Right. I mean, just because it's topical right now, because if he's still running, I don't know who it has or hasn't dropped out, but you have to remind me of his name. I believe it's Yang, but who's proposing $1,000 a month for everybody? Is that him? Is that
Hmm.
the right name?
Yeah.
I mean, like, it's not going to solve everything, but like, and make it a fuck ton better. If you could like just leave somebody, go to a shelter for however long as you needed to, or not even have to go to a shelter or some other. I mean, if it was a good shelter, I guess, but just being able to take $1,000 and go protect yourself. I mean, if you had that sort of confirmed, if you had that steady, guaranteed income, you'd have a lot more freedom than like they say, like a lot of it has to do with being isolated and financially and societally dependent on the abuser. And so like free, free quote unquote free money or just guaranteed money could go a long way, and having the other sort of social um, platforms that would be available for in a country or a government that would adopt something like the guaranteed salary, would also be in place, and that would all go a long way to stopping these sort of transgressions from continuing uninterrupted.
Yeah, there's definitely certain issues with Yang specific, like the specifics of his policy, but
Sure.
in general, I'm a fan of universal basic income. It's just sort of a matter of how you do it. There's sort of like a more libertarian way, and then a more, I guess, socialist way to do it. And he's definitely more on like the libertarian sort of tech bro side of it. But I think his heart's in the right place overall.
Well, let's start with taxing Amazon at all, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. Yeah, he's a big proponent of taxing Amazon, so that's good. Um, okay, but I guess just to make sure we don't run out of time before we get to the heart of the issue here. I mean, the title is a question: Is masculinity a terrorist ideology?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Now, I think Johnson actually does a pretty good job of making the case, particularly with the part where she explicitly talks about the number of terrorist attacks that happen versus the number of domestic abuse type violence that occurs, or not even just violence, but actual killings that occur. And yeah, I think it maybe is like a larger question of like how exactly do we define terrorism? She sort of brings it up how it sort of has like a fuzzy definition, but at least if you're sort of thinking about like you know the ways that sort of violence or intimidation is like mass produced for particular purposes, I think she makes kind of a compelling case. At least, at the very least, she kind of forces you to grapple with like why are so many men abusing so many women, whether or not you call it terrorism. But ultimately, I think that yeah, a lot of like the psychological components of like what do we associate with masculinity and how does that sort of play itself out in practice, I think ultimately kind of bears out her point, even though I think it's definitely meant to be provocative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, like, well, that's the thing, because if somebody were to say, no, masculinity isn't a terrorist ideology, well, then the follow up question is, okay, what's terrorism and what's masculinity? And I mean, if we don't have hard answers for those things, it's easy to say no and just sort of dismiss it. But if you're sort of press people to make sure they have a definition, I mean, you'd be surprised if you compared terrorism and masculinity as far as the end effects and sort of the places that they come from. You'd probably have a pretty tight circle of Venn diagram. I think it has a lot to do with, you know, there's been some mild shift as we've gotten better and with these type of things. I'm not saying anything is like solved in any capacity, but I mean changing masculinity from being like emotionless and like centered and just in control to like the idea of like a caretaker or like empathy or something like that. Like if we can change what it means to be masculine or what it means to be a man, then no longer will it be considered a terrorist ideology. But because that hasn't changed, then yeah, as it sits right now, it's more in line with violence than it is with anything else, as far as the end results, anyways. Even if that's not what it says, even if that's not the language you use, the product is.
The only benefit I think that we do get from her sort of ending with the more individual angle rather than the systemic angle is that it does sort of implicitly open up the door for the salvation of masculinity as sort of a label. And I guess that's also like a sort of a larger question of like what is like the value of having gender labels, but to the extent that labels are sort of important for people to sort of like make sense of their own lives, she definitely sort of ends by pretty explicitly saying that like masculinity can be something good, but there needs to be some sort of cultural or systemic change in order to make that happen, which I think is what she's sort of saying. Like, we need to first see the problem and then we can address it. And by addressing it, I think she's is pretty much saying like addressing it means like making these cultural or systemic changes in order to come out on the other side with some sort of masculinity that is not centered around violence in the way that currently is. So
Mm-hmm.
I think we do at least get that from the ending.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well that is the time for this one. So Alex, what is your artifact for this week?
Well, fortunately, Justin, I get a little treat because it's basically like I get to do two safe rooms for one in one episode. Um, but it's also a good, well-written, constructed article, so this is a win-win for me. But my article is, and I'm going to say this contends for best titled article. You've mentioned other article titles that were good, but they weren't your main artifact. So I'm going to put this on the podium for
True.
best title. Fuck Lena Dunham and the White Feminist Horse She Rode In On by Sharonda J. Brown and Laura Witt from whereyourvoicemag.com. So this article is fairly recent, as of like the end of 2018, but it's been a sort of a long time coming as far as the things that they talk about with Lena Dunham, but it seems to be a direct response also to two articles that were written in other magazines. The first being Lena Dunham is a hugely original writer. Who cares if she's a good person by Martha Gill at The Guardian. And then Katie Herzog writing The pleasure of hating Lena Dunham is less about her and more about us for The Stranger. And I mean, they say in this one for the first article is before you ask, yes, she is implied, or to the implied question that is Martha Gill white. And so it's talking about, this sort of takes white feminism to task and how white feminism and the feminism that Lena Dunham, subscribes herself to and is, well, maybe not in name, but in action, is just white supremacy plus, or with an asterisk, which just means white supremacy with women also, instead of just, the patriarchy. It's the, I don't know. Is there a single word for white supremacy? I mean, white supremacy is only two words. I don't think we need to cut it that much, but white feminism is just replacing the patriarchy with white supremacy for all whites instead of just the men. And so the article starts with saying that both of these articles and other things are sort of proactive damage control ahead of the long string of apologies for shitty behavior from Dunham, and they sort of talk about maybe 3 to 4 or 5 of these. The sort of most egregious, especially from the feminist angle, is an issue where a woman named Aurora Perneau revealed last year in 2017 that she was raped by Maury Miller, who worked with Lena Dunham on the Girls, Lena Dunham's show that she's the showrunner and the head writer for and sort of the creator of. But with her first quote, when in response, denying Aurora's allegations, saying, "While our first instinct is to listen to every woman's story, our insider knowledge of Maury's situation makes us confident that sadly this accusation is one of the 3% of assault cases that governments report every year. It's a true shame to add that number, as outside Hollywood women still struggle to be believed. We stand by Maury, and this is all we'll be saying about the issue." And then fast forward to a year later, to which Lena apologizes that she had lied and that her lie had harmed a black person who was sexually assaulted at 17 years old, with her follow-up apology quote being, quote, "I didn't have the insider information I claimed, but rather blind faith in a story that kept slipping and changing and revealed itself to me nothing at all." And that's not really an apology. I mean, it is, but that doesn't do anything, right? And so, and there's a long history. I mean, they don't touch on all of it, but, she said in her own book that she wrote that she molested her, younger sister when she was an infant. And the comments that she made about Odell Beckham Jr., where she just immediately assumed because he wasn't hitting on her that he just, wasn't attracted to her because I guess she was, overweight or something. And that just got weirdly blown out of proportion, and Odell Beckham Jr. didn't do anything besides sit near her and be black, that she was just very upset about, as far as we can all tell. He wasn't trying to hit her up, and so that was a personal affront, I guess. That's pretty much all we can get from her mentality about it. And the sort of article goes on to sort of use very recent. I mean, they could write dozens of articles about, the damage of white feminism, but I mean, they can just take from the last, year or two. Specifically, they reference the movie Beguiled, which is a Southern, Gothic film, which, has no lead black characters in it, and the characters that were in the book were completely erased, as far as replacing one of them with Kirsten Dunst, who, if you can find a whiter actress, you'd be hard pressed, besides maybe Lena Dunham herself. but the complete erasure of black characters from a book into a movie set in the South is it's bad anyways, but it's sort of alarming to like have that sentence out there when you like hear it. And then the sort of feminist icon show of Handmaid's Tale, which is based on a book by Margaret Atwood, where the show has completely edited out the eugenics sort of white supremacy background themes of it for the sake of just, you know, white feminism as portrayed by the woman leading the show from Mad Men, who the actress's name escapes me, but I'm going to find it right now and then I'm going to edit it so it's said, looks like I said it the whole time, as portrayed in the lead by Elizabeth Moss and the other characters, even though, you know, these things were happening in real life to people of color, women and men alike, I mean, especially women, obviously. And, you know, she goes on to even challenge Margaret Atwood, the original author, who, talking about it later, quote, said in a recent interview that everything I wrote in that book was happening at the time or had already happened. It just wasn't happening in America, which, I mean, anybody with, you know, knowledge and history is familiar with the, what's that called? You know, we're going to pause it again real quick. So the author, just let me catch up to saying Tuskegee syphilis experiment, then you can cut it, or then you can like start it back up again. And the author takes Margaret Atwood to task as well, where they take a quote from her saying that, you know, all of this. Fuck, where'd the quote go? Bitch. Damn it, I had it too. Where, you know, we have things like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment that were very much happening and really weren't happening all that long ago. I mean, this study was conducted up through 1972. I mean, any time is too recent for that to be happening, but to just sort of have that blind spot when talking on your high horse about how you were always right anyways. And she goes on to do other sort of top hits, including Hillary Clinton, who we've talked about before with her comment about super predators. And just sort of ends on, you know, if we held Lena Dunham to the same, you know, heights as we held other problematic white people that were men, such as Harvey Weinstein or Louis C.K., we'd all be better off instead of just letting white women hide behind the veil of female and not championing their side of whiteness. But Justin, what do you have to say?
I really don't know that much about Lena Dunham, although I do vaguely remember that story of her, like, doing whatever sort of sexual harassment to her niece or whatever. So basically, my general takeaway from this article was that it is totally correct in the sense of, like, yeah, I mean, there's whole, like, schools of feminism. There's, like, multiple schools of feminism that have been created just, like, as responses to white feminism and its failings,
What
including... What?
white feminism is first wave feminism, right? Is that the same? Are those two interchangeable?
I think you could make that argument. I'm not, but I would also say that that probably erases some of the early work of feminists of color. But I think, because like you already had like there was definitely like women of color who were feminists writing back
Sure.
in those times anyway. But I don't think we necessarily think of them anyway when we think of white feminism or first wave feminism, rather. So yeah, I don't know if you might be able to equate them and just do the same erasure that they already happened. I don't know, but yeah. So like even there's even one school that's just called itself like womanism, just because they're like, yeah, feminism is so like trash that we're not even gonna call ourselves feminism. We're just gonna like come with a new name. But anyway, so I think so. Obviously, I agree with like the ways in which like feminism can become something that doesn't attend to racism at all, which is, you know, there's a lot of women are people of color, so like that's something you have to attend to. But the one thing I do think the article sort of muddles a little bit is like I don't think it's so as important that Lena Dunham is a terrible person as much as she's just a terrible feminist in the ways that are like racist, as the article sort of points out. because if she was terrible in other ways, I don't think that would necessarily like preclude her from being a
Mm.
properly allied feminist. But it's like
Mm-hmm.
the particular ways in which she's terrible, which just also seem like so random. Like it's not. It doesn't even seem like there's not like it doesn't seem like she has like a complete ideology. It just seems like she's just kind of like a shitty, vaguely racist person.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like she's racist for sure, but she's also like you said, like she's bad at also being a feminist.
hmm
Like neither of them are good. Like she's not even just I mean she's well she's very good at being a white feminist probably.
well, yeah. I mean, we know our fair share of white feminists. I think not to name
Ooh
names.
we. Mm-hmm. Or entire colleges, but
But yeah, I mean, I think it's also good too just to have this article back to back with the last one that we just looked at. Yeah, I think there's probably like a tendency for people who don't really have a reason to like look into this stuff to just think of feminism in the singular, and that like
mm-hmm.
anyone who calls themselves a feminist is obviously on the same side. But like, yeah, these writers are like very clearly pissed. Like
Oh yeah,
they don't care that Lena Dunham is a quote unquote feminist. They're just like coming for her throat here, which is
absolutely.
rich respect.
Oh, for sure. And they take other, sort of outspoken white feminists to task. So the quotes from Rose McGowan and Bette Midler um, are insane because these are both, women who are very much championed by other white women at this point, hopefully exclusively. But like Bette Midler's quote, "White women are the N-word of the world."
I think I do remember that.
Raped, beaten, enslaved, married off, worked like dumb animals, denied education and inheritance, enduring the pain and danger of childbirth and life in silence for thousands of years. They are the most disrespected creatures on earth. Bet women are black, like black women are women too, Chief. Like they're not mutually exclusive, brother. I just, and then like Rose McGowan's when in response to James Corden making jokes about Harvey Weinstein, which James Corden's trash too, but that's for another day. Um, James Corden making jokes about Harvey Weinstein, is it too soon? And to which she says in all caps, "This is rich, famous Hollywood white male privilege in action. Replace the word women with the N word. How does it feel?" Rose, like they're not mutually exclusive. Like there's women who are also black. Like you can't I just
I can
I
just
don't
say
know.
too, Tarana Burke was the woman who started Me Too.
Mm,
Uh,
perfect.
but yeah, I wasn't sure where you were trying to go with that last point, but
I was because just that like Rose McGowan is gained a lot of popularity recently. Rose McGowan has become like sort of a social political figure for being one of the first famous white ladies to do the hashtag Me Too, and so it's in misappropriated to her in a lot of ways
hmm
that she's like as a sort of speaking figurehead for the movement that
hmm
like isn't hers, and she's also fucked up a lot.
But the other thing I could point out about the article, I don't know why they point to Megyn Kelly, Ivanka Trump, Melania Trump, and Tommy Lauren as being feminists. I feel like
I
I
have
don't even know
no
if they
idea.
would call themselves feminists.
Ivanka Trump probably would. Tommy Lauren definitely wouldn't. Are you fucking kidding me? She'd lose every single one of her goddamn fans if she called herself a feminist. That's fuck. I thought the same thing. No, that's fucking insane. She would never, ever, ever give herself that goddamn label. The Trumps are a little iffy about it. Like they don't actually do anything, but like I feel like Ivanka like really thinks she's like, well, a female forward icon. I don't know if she'd use that language, but she wants like that label. Maybe not that
Mhm.
word, but she definitely wants it. Megyn Kelly, I mean, I don't. She's like all over the fucking place, dude. She just goes where the money is. I don't like, which I respect that, but not actually, not in practice.
Yeah, so I that part was kind of weird to me, but I did like the very next part where they call it Hillary Clinton because yeah, there's definitely a lot of people who think they're feminists that were that just
Oh,
ignored the fucked up things Hillary Clinton said, but
and does.
that too. So yeah, I don't know, I thought that was sort of a not to
Yeah.
relegate 2016
People
3 years
still don't.
later,
Yeah,
but
it's. when it stops being relevant, when people stop like asking for Hillary to rerun, we'll stop roasting her. Like, we don't owe her. She doesn't leave her alone. She's too what, old or rich or wants to be president. Like, I don't give a shit. And fucking roast them all into the ground. It's fine. This is for us anyways. This whole podcast is just for us. So we're just gonna keep shitting on Hillary because that's what we like. And you know, I'm always happy to shit on Lena Dunham, and so I was happy that I got to take this opportunity. I didn't even have to waste a safe room on it. And that's, and we'll do the noise. Clink, clink, clink. So if are we doing the, or you do the now that we're in the safe room? Is that a standard?
So now that we're in the safe room, Alex, feel free to go ahead and say what's on your mind.
So what's on my mind is, you know, there's a lot of talk about like, just saying that something's a trope, like isn't like, some people think that just saying something's a trope means that like you're like a, you know, you've critiqued your critical genius and everything that happens, or that that's just very lazy. And, you know, neither are right or wrong, but there is a trope that I would like to take to task, and I think that needs to get retired, much like the word problematic. And that would be wherever there's a sense of like tension or character like motivation or anything in a plot where a character, usually a woman, but it can be a man or just a couple, is unable to produce children together biologically, and that like just act like that's the end of the fucking world and that there's literally no other option, and you know, we're barren and so we can't have kids, and just it ruins my whole life. It's just adopt somebody, you fucking selfish piece of shit, just because it doesn't look like you. It didn't come from your nuts or your fucking uterus. Like I don't know why that's ever been like a source of tension outside of like royalty in the 1500s. Like I don't like. Well, my clock's ticking. I gotta make sure I have a kid now. Man, you could just go find one. Just go grab one. They want you. They'd love to have you. You selfish motherfucker. There's like to have shows still like to this like very year. Like the one show, spoiler alert, called Dead to Me. One of the characters' like big sort of arcs and emotional trauma and tension is the fact that they're like really trying to have a kid, and that's the only reason they keep sticking around with this like piece of shit guy is because she needs somebody to get her pregnant. No, you don't. No, you don't.
There's definitely kids out there looking to be adopted. It's probably not too late for you to get late term adopted as well, if that's what your underlying motive is here. I have hope for you yet.
Why would you blow it up like that, dude? That's not
gonna work. I mean, I can understand why people would be sad about if they, you know, built up these expectations that they would be able to have kids, but I don't know. I guess it's sort of like a question of like what the role of media is, I guess, and like how we want to portray various aspects of human life, I guess.
Well, one aspect of human life I don't think anybody needs to see is a fucking movie where a family goes to adopt a kid and they pick a fucking rat. Stuart Little is a fucking stupid ass movie. You can also get a kid. It's a rat. Get a kid too. You out of your fucking mind? It takes up 3 inches of real estate, you fucking animals.
Wow, I was not expecting Stuart Little to take one to the dome in the safe room here.
That's what the real safe room is about. Truly, this has all been building to this crescendo of me fucking dunking on Stuart Little. This podcast is over. We're not recording your safe room. We're never doing another episode. I'm not. As soon as this one's produced,
I'm pretty sure our fans think we're not doing another episode at this point. So, yeah.
You can make that joke in any single episode. It'll fit perfectly. Mostly because it's not a
joke. When I said our friends don't think, I mean our fans are hoping that we don't do another episode. Yeah, I think they could definitely emphasize adoption more. I think it's an important topic, but at the same time, I can sort of see why. I think it depends how they play it. Like, I think it's okay to be sad if you thought you were going to be able to have a kid on your own and then you have to adopt, but I guess probably still just adopt, I guess.
You can be a little sad, but it's like there's a pretty 1-to-1 solution. Truly.
Was there a reason that this is your safe room, or just because you saw it on that show, or?
Well, I saw it on that show, and I just sort of became like that show particularly because I didn't like really empathize with the character, but like I've seen that kind of consistently on media, and that's just sort of my like personal point of view. Is I like honestly champion adoption more than natural childbirth, anyways. But like I don't know, there was like a movie that came out a couple of years ago called Lion, with Nicole Kidman and I believe his name's David Patel, and it's based on a real story about a Australian family, Dev Patel, excuse me, that just like adopts a couple of kids from India, and he's like, at some point, he's like, "Why did you adopt me?" He's like, "Because you couldn't have kids," and she's like, "No, we could have kids, but like we didn't need to bring more people in the world, and people needed kids, like parents, anyways." And I was like, "Yeah, fuck yeah." Makes a lot of sense. And then like after I like heard that, I just sort of like that really sort of like honed in my perspective on like any time that like was like a point of contention in a film. I was just like, this is a non-issue as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not super familiar with like all the specifics of adoption and how much you get to know about the kid and how much choice you get and stuff.
I
But
I'm not either, but also like I don't know. Isn't it like kind of better than like just absolutely like devastating your body for the sake of like a kid that kind of looks like you anyways? Like it's like I don't know. Like it's just like it's for like a woman. Like I don't know. And like for a guy, like we'll get a little weird and dark into it, but like I don't know. It's like can't really like I birthed this child. Like and it's like it's gonna be a more equal relationship. I feel like as parents. Like you aren't playing from the back end for 9 months. It kind of sounds like a men's rights thing right now, but it's not what I'm going for. But
yeah, I don't know. I don't really have any major disagreement here. Yeah, I think it's good to adopt if that's something you're interested in.
if that's your kind of thing, coming off like a real centrist, I'm coming off like a real men's rights activist. You happy with this, Justin? Does this feel
I
good for
don't know
you?
what the radical position on adoption is.
No more. Don't birth. Nobody else should be birthed. That's my position. We don't need them. Immaculate conception exclusively.
3D print some babies or something.
I'd make a real fucked up baby. Finally, somebody's uglier than me.
Don't get carried away.
I would try. I would hire the top scientists. I need somebody to write this code.
Code's a crime against humanity. You have to go to some like
That's what they said about
Russian, Chinese backstreet black market.
they still say no. There's no price high enough worth it. All right, Justin, what do you have to complain about today?
All right. So, my safe room this week is about people needing to respect cultural studies. Basically, I guess off the bat, I could say cultural studies is a lot of things, any sort of like critical race theory or philosophy, literary theory, feminism, Marxism, post-colonialism, all these things and more would fall under cultural studies. And I'm making a larger point about the way that we know things and where expertise comes from. So to start off with, it should be obvious, but I guess it's not. No one can be an expert in every single field. Everyone's probably somewhat of an expert in something. I mean, even if your job is just whatever, like you work in fast food, you're a nurse, or whatever job you have, like you're probably very knowledgeable about what you do, and you're sort of like an expert in that field. But you're not going to be an expert in everything. There's not enough time.
You're not going to be an expert in everything.
Right.
Don't speak for me.
So it's even like the person, whoever you think is like the smartest person in the world, like I guarantee there's some topic that they just know absolutely nothing about at all.
Like, for example, you're really bad at naming jobs on the fly.
The point I'm trying to make here is basically that's why we even have the concept of expertise in the first place. Because if you want something done, you want to go to whoever's the most knowledgeable, given that you're not going to be knowledgeable about everything. So at some point, you're going to need to see an expert. So this is obvious if we think of like a mechanical engineer, a surgeon, or a mechanic. Okay, like you're not going to, you would never say like, oh, I don't need a doctor to perform this open heart surgery. I have my, my two eyes, and I have a brain. I have my common sense. I'll just do this heart surgery myself. Like you would never do that because that would be stupid. But for some reason, when it comes to cultural studies, people will try to engage with people who have been studying these various topics for decades of their lives. And meanwhile, you've just been sitting in your basement doing nothing. And for some reason, you think that you can just discuss feminism with Judith Butler or something. Like, you can't. It's just as stupid as if you tried to do open heart surgery on yourself because you have common sense or something. Like, it's equally dumb. But I guess maybe where this misunderstanding comes from is that we can't, or if we go to the mechanic example, you try and fix your own car, you say, the mechanic said that you need a working engine for the car to run, but, I don't really think that's true. Like, you're going to find out immediately that you're wrong. But with cultural studies, I guess, you don't necessarily find out, you say something stupid like, I don't know, trans people don't exist or something. Like, you don't immediately feel the impact of you being wrong. But really, like, the impact of being wrong is felt in the way that, one day you're saying trans people don't exist, the next day they're telling everyone what bathrooms you're forced to go in, or even, we don't have to think of trans issues, like, even, like, they'll start telling you what countries you're allowed to live in, where you're allowed to move, just, like, day-to-day, the dignity you experience on a day-to-day basis is, like, going to be compromised as you, like, concede ground, because you don't need no expert telling you no information. The bigger point too is that cultural studies is really for everyone at the end of the day. It's about how do we all sort of like gain equality by like thinking through some of these various issues. And again, it covers a lot of ground, but gender, race, whatever it is, like it affects everyone. And the people who study this are working to like create like the most equal system that we can create. I guess the other thing too I can point out is that every field has unsolved questions. Like people say, well, cultural studies isn't as objective as science, let's say, but we know that science also has points that just aren't settled. Whether it's a small point like, are eggs good for you or not? The answer changes all the time. Or it could be a point as big as like, is the universe going to keep growing forever, or is it eventually going to shrink back down? Science also can't answer this definitively. So yes, there's questions that cultural studies also cannot answer definitively. It doesn't mean that the field is not still valuable. So basically, yeah, given that we're not experts, we are left with three choices. You can continue babbling ignorantly, posing these stupid questions to people whose time is not worth your effort, or you can actually listen to these people and learn from them and accept what they say. Or if you're not going to do either of these, then your only choice is to like read up yourself and become an expert. But that's basically it. And yeah, my point is just that it doesn't matter what field you're in, you have to respect expertise, and cultural studies is no different.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. You came in with some bars, buddy. You had some hypotheticals and some answers. I like that. I had sort of mine where you don't feel the immediate damage of open heart surgery versus a transphobic comment, and then also, the lack of certainty, but, that's what a hypothesis are all about. It's the whole point. I mean, technically, you can't prove evolution, like, is happening like day to day, like you get it.
Yeah, I mean, all the knowledge we have is just based on what can we disprove, and everything's only as true so far as it hasn't been disproven yet. But technically, anything can be disproven. I mean, even if we think of like gravity, like people often say, like, okay, they say the theory of gravity, but we know gravity is real. But like at certain levels, like we don't actually know how gravity works. Like with these like super massive objects and black holes, like we kind of don't know how gravity works around those. So it's like that's why it's the theory of gravity, because like it can be disproven. We might figure out something that sort of like reshapes it. That doesn't mean that all of science is garbage.
Right. And I mean, like, I don't know, just like anything else, like it's just you participating in it and you just like learn more. Not all opinions are equal and not all opinions are valid. I'm gonna be honest with you. Fucking like anti-vaxxing, like what? Like I don't know, just like you could just be wrong about shit. And like that's true of just like things that aren't as like you can't like physically manifest, like things like trans issues and things like that. Like I don't know, and just like even just like racial relation history that people try to like argue over.
Mm-hmm.
Just like you can just be wrong about things that you can't like touch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's like large, thoughtful conversations happening in literally any field you can think of. It doesn't matter how objective you think the field is. There are
Mm-hmm.
conversations, debates going on in it.
Yeah, I just remember that like Stephen Hawking's got like roasted for like one of the like in his own community about like some like black hole theory, but like I don't know, like it's just, but, like these things aren't like set in stone, but you also don't need to tell anybody what you think if you haven't thought about it. Like
Mm-hmm.
I thought about this for the last 5 seconds. Here's my knee-jerk reaction. Is it like
Yeah.
are not your thoughts on it? That's just like you said, it's just fucking mouth noise.
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way for anyone to understand this is, like I started in the beginning, like you're probably an expert at your job. Like you wouldn't want someone who doesn't do your job to like tell you how to do your job. And that's the
Right.
same with cultural studies. Like people who've been doing this for decades, and then some dude who's never heard of the field thinks that they can like find some flaw in it, crack some code that like they've never thought of. It's like, no, like step. I don't tell you how to do your job. Don't tell me how to do my job.
Absolutely.
All right, that's our show for this week. See the show notes for a link to view the artifacts for yourself.
Music for the podcast has been produced by Nicholas Pizzuto.
Find some way to, give us a like on YouTube or, do whatever you want. Tell a friend, tell an enemy about the show, and join us again in who knows how many weeks as we find 2 new texts to discuss.
Hey, Justin, we know that 2 out of the last 4 presidents are rapists in some capacity. But it's bad that we have to ask if they're pedophiles, right? Like, I'm not saying they are, but like, you have to ask, you know?
Yeah, I'm not even sure we have to ask at this point, but
I mean, yeah, well, we'll wait for the Mueller report on it.